Hi, my name's Lindsay. I'm a biologist and I have a master's degree in biology, and today I'm going to talk about invasive species. So in order to talk about invasive species, we have to know what invasive species are. It's basically a species that isn't native to the area or to the ecosystem, and it causes destruction, great harm to the ecosystem. One example is Burmese pythons in the Everglades, which is in the state of Florida. And then I just briefly want to discuss the difference between an introduced species and an invasive species. An introduced species, a good example of this would be wolves in Yellowstone. Those are an introduced species. They were at one point native and then ended up being eradicated from the area. And so scientists and biologists came together and made a decision based off of science that we were going to reintroduce wolves back into Yellowstone, which was where they were at one point native. An invasive species is a species that just comes, and we'll talk about how invasive species get introduced, but it's not scientists making the decision. It's not an intentional thing from a science standpoint. It's, pets being released into the wild. We'll discuss a little bit more of that. But also, introduced species are typically tracked and monitored by the state, with biologists and scientists and researchers tracking their movements. Invasive species, we don't really have the ability to do that. So just so that we kind of can differentiate the two between introduced and invasive. All right, so how do invasive species actually affect the ecosystem? Why are they bad for the ecosystem? Really great question. And this is pretty fundamental, like understanding this is pretty fundamental to the topic of invasive species. Basically, in short, invasive species will outcompete native species for resources. Resources meaning food, water, shelter. And because of this, they can actually alter the food webs. So one of the examples that I'll give is Cuban tree frogs, which are invasive in Florida, are outcompeting the native frog species because invasive species or the Cuban tree frogs, which are invasive, are eating the native frog species. So that is one way how they are altering the food web. But then and the third bullet point, how they can prey upon the native species. But then also the Cuban tree frog population is kind of growing a little out of control, and so they are competing with the native species for food and habitat. And it has caused a decline in the native frog species in Florida. And this can ultimately reduce biodiversity. If your native frog population is declining, there are multiple native frog species in Florida that the Cuban tree frogs are preying upon and competing for resources. So it's going to obviously lead to a reduce in the biodiversity there, and obviously a decline in the native species. So how do invasive species even happen in ecosystems? The first one we're going to talk about is basically they get released into the wild. This can be household pets, part of the exotic pet trade. But it's whether it's intentional or unintentional, they get released into the wild. And you only need a couple of invasive species to wreak havoc and for the population to just continue to grow. Another example, cargo ships. This happened with Cuban tree frogs. I don't remember the exact year, but it has been a while. I believe the cargo ships came from either Cuba or somewhere down in the Caribbean, and there were Cuban tree frogs on the cargo ships, came to Miami or somewhere in South Florida, and from there the population of Cuban tree frogs grew. Household pets, this ties into the first bullet point that I was talking about. You get a household pet like a ball python, a goldfish, whatever, and you get tired of it and you don't want it anymore, and people will release it into the wild, and from there they can expand and grow. And then the exotic pet trade escapes, whether that's intentional or not intentional, it doesn't really matter. The exotic pet trade does contribute to invasive species happening. Why are invasive species so difficult to eradicate? There's a few reasons for this. The first one, they have very high reproduction rates, and they typically have babies or clutches multiple times a year, way more than native species would. Typically, they grow and develop a lot faster than the native species, and a lot of the time the invasive species don't have nearly as many predators as the native species do. So all three of those things kind of create this perfect storm for invasive species populations to just grow out of control. Especially with invasive species not having very many predators, that really does play a huge role in how the population just grows and grows and grows. Typically, once an invasive species is kind of established in an ecosystem, it is very, very, very difficult. I would say nearly impossible to eradicate the population, just because they're so well established and they have high reproduction rates and, all of the three things that we just talked about. Some of the management strategies would be removal and or humane euthanasia, fertility control. I was at a conference last year in October, and one of the presenters was talking about fertility control in wild boars. I don't know how that relates to other animal species, but I included that. And then specifically for plant species, we can use specialized herbicides. We can also do prescribed burns. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, I hope you take away that prevention is crucial. It is key to essentially preserving the ecosystem. So don't release pets into the wild. This is how invasive species can occur, and we don't want that. So please do not release pets into the wild. Plant only native plant species. Don't move firewood. There is an invasive insect called the emerald ash borer that lives in firewood, and so if we don't check and inspect the firewood for it, and we pick the firewood up and we move it somewhere else, the emerald ash borer could be in that piece of wood, and now we've just moved it to a different geographical region, and the population could just continue there. So really important to check firewood, and then also check your boats and water equipment before you put it in the water, and then clean them when you take them out of the water, because there are some invasive aquatic species that will attach to boat propellers, the sides of your boat, even water equipment like scuba gear, and if we don't inspect and clean them and we take it from lake to lake to lake, then we could just be contributing to the spread of invasive species, and we don't want to be doing that. And then finally, if you see an invasive species, you need to report it. Most of the state wildlife organizations, like in the state of Florida, it's Florida Fish and Wildlife. They usually have some kind of reporting hotline or somewhere that you can go online to report it, but it's very important that you report it so that the state agency can track it and monitor it, and that they know about it. Some examples of invasive species in North America: obviously the Burmese pythons in the Everglades, Cuban tree frogs. The photo in the top right corner, that's a Cuban tree frog. Bufo or cane toads. They are in Florida. It's the photo right below the Cuban tree frog. They are invasive in Florida. Lionfish, that's the upper left corner. House sparrow is right below the lionfish. Eurasian collared dove, emerald ash borer, we were talking about that in the firewood. Japanese beetles, and feral pigs, which are the same as wild boars. So just quickly want to discuss the difference between an invasive species and a non-native species. An invasive species is what we've been talking about this entire presentation. It causes great harm to the ecosystem, and they are not native. A non-native species is a species that is not native but doesn't actively cause destruction to the ecosystem. All right, so I have a few questions that I would like you to put your answers to in the comments. The first question is, why are invasive species a problem? Second question, what kind of damage or destruction do invasive species cause to the ecosystem? Number 3, what is the difference between an introduced species and an invasive species? And number 3, what are some invasive species in your area? And include your geographical region, and then list off some of the invasive species that are in your area. I'm very interested, and this is obviously region specific. If you live in Canada, your invasive species are going to be different than if you live in Georgia or Florida or Alabama. So I'm very curious to know what invasive species live in your area. You may have to do a little bit of research, but that's good because then you learn about what invasive species are in your region. And then if you have any other questions, put them in the comments and I will answer them. Thank you for watching.